Hey there, Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to another episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you, the consumer, how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we will show you how to paint the Exiled Dead for your games of Warhammer Underworlds both quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. By following the tips and techniques as well as materials that we suggest, we can help you paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for about $29.57. Now, when you compare this with the materials that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter to paint your miniatures exactly the same way, we're talking about a grand total savings of $158.53 being saved, because we're comparing that with $188.10 from the materials that you need to get from both Citadel as well as Army Painter. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's go and talk about exactly how to quickly and, more importantly, cheaply paint up your Exiled Dead for your war games of Warhammer Underworld. Now, the first thing, of course, you have to do is to assemble your miniatures, and this part is actually quite easy because the Warhammer Underworld miniatures are actually all push fit, so they should actually be able to assemble very, very quickly. Now, the next part about the bases, you can actually skip the texturing on this one, and the reason why is because all of the Exiled Dead miniature bases actually have like an interesting cobblestone walkway type of sculpt going on those bases, so we don't really need to worry about texturing too much. We do, of course, need to prime our miniatures, and when it comes to priming, the material I like to use is Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $3.99. I just do it once over the entirety of the miniatures, so that way I have a good base coat to work off of. Now, priming does a couple of things that's really important for miniatures war painting. The first thing it does, of course, is to create a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to paint acrylic paint directly onto your miniatures on its Blair plastic without any primer, the slightest amount of friction would actually cause the acrylic paint to rub off your miniature, which would ruin the overall finish. Primer actually prevents that from happening because it gives a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Now, the second thing that primer also does as well is that it indirectly actually has a impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you're using. Traditionally speaking, the darker the primer, the darker the color scheme you want to use for your miniatures, whereas the lighter the color scheme you want to use, the lighter your primer you should use. And since we're going to do a quick paint method on this where we're using a oil wash on our miniatures, which will darken down the colors, we're going to use that white color in order to do so. Now, once you guys get done with doing that, of course, what you need to do is start base coating your miniatures. I pretty much just trying to divide up the warband into various different groups based on the skin tones that they have. So, for example, little Malekith right there on the left-hand side, who's like the Igor version of this group, I paint up as two thin layers of crisp green by Apple Barrel paint. As for the Necromancer in the middle, I painted his skin with two layers of bright magenta by Apple Barrel. I then also took one of the Arc Walkers and put two thin coats of nutmeg brown for that character. For two more of the different Arc Walkers, I put them in flesh by Apple Barrel paint. And for the other two Arc Walkers, I painted their flesh using Anita's acrylic taupe gray in order to make their flesh make it look like it's kind of nice and pale. And then for the one that the huge Frankenstein arm looking thing, I use Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel paint as well. Now, each of these paints you can get at your local Walmart. They all cost 50 cents a piece, except for the Anita's acrylic. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby, and that runs 65 cents. What you'll need to do, of course, is put two thin coats of this for the flesh, and now that we got a good base coat to work off of, we can move on to dry brushing. Now, dry brushing does a couple of things. What dry brushing actually does, it creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures, because when you dry brush your miniatures, the individual pigments of paint actually adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while leaving that darker color in the recesses, which creates shadows as well as also depth. So when it comes to your Necromancer, we're going to actually dry brush that guy with Cameo Pink by Apple Barrel paint. For all the fighters that actually have greenish flesh tones, we're going to use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel paint. For the ones that we did in Taupe Gray earlier, we're going to use Ivory by Apple Barrel paint. For the flesh colored ones, we're going to use Delta Sarin Coats Peaches and Cream, and for the one that we did in Nutmeg Brown, we're going to use Flesh by Apple Barrel paint. Now, all the Apple Barrel paints, of course, cost 50 cents at your local Walmart. The Delta Serum Coat actually costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby as well. And we're just going to dry brush all the flesh that's exposed on these guys to create that illusion of depth. Now, if you do notice, there is a little bit of a chalky kind of pastel finish on these miniatures when you do dry brushing. If you do see that, do not stress out. And the reason why is because when we actually get to the oil washing stage, that transitions are going to smooth out and that chalkiness is going to go away as well. So the next detail we're going to work on is on the Necromancer himself. He's got these kind of creepy looking robes that look like they're made out of human flesh. So to make that look like that, we're going to base coat his entire robes in two thin layers of nutmeg brown. That way it looks like it's made out of a darker skin tone. So that way it looks like he's wearing a robes made out of human skin, which makes him even more terrifying looking. And the next detail we're going to work on, of course, are the black details on some of these fighters as well. So some of these fighters are wearing, like Arc Walkers especially, are wearing some torn up looking trousers as well as shirts. So for, as you can see in this picture, I took two of the Arc Walkers as well as a little Malekith character, and I painted their pants in 2 thin layers of pigment paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I also used the same pigment paint on the Arc Walker with a knife, so that way I did her tunic that she's wearing, and then of course I did the overall hood collar type thing that the Necromancer is also wearing as well. So once you guys put your 2 thin layers on that, the next thing we need to work on is a dry brush. So for all the colors that we just did earlier in black, we're going to put 2 thin layers. We're just going to do a quick dry brush with some pewter gray real quick directly onto the shirt, as well as the trousers of the Arc Walkers, as well as in the hood and the belt and the boots of the Necromancer as well. That dry brushing, of course, is a beautiful job of showing some of the details that we couldn't see earlier, things like folds in the fabric, as well as like the pitted rips in the fabric as well. So that looks absolutely amazing. Continuing on with the clothing for some of our Arc Walkers, we're also going to pick out some other Arc Walkers with their dress as well as their trousers. We're going to pick that at 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic moccasin brown. It's a beautiful reddish brown color that also contrasts very nicely to the skin tones that these guys are wearing. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. So you can see in this photo, I just basically did 2 thin layers on the trousers of the 2 Arc Walkers on the right hand side, as well as the skirt on the Arc Walker on the left hand side. Another element we're also going to work on as well is on the wooden elements that these characters have too. Now one of the Arc Walkers is actually carrying a wooden club, while another Arc Walker is carrying a halberd, and of course the Necromancer is carrying his electric looking staff thing. So to pick out those details of lumber, we just use 2 thin layers of burnt umber by Applebarrel paint. It's a beautiful dark brown color that you can get at your local Walmart, and it costs about 50 cents. And once you put your 2 thin layers on that, we can move on to our next details. And the next detail we're going to work on next is on the Necromancer. So the Necromancer actually has a pair of hands that he's using as basically as shoulder plates in order to protect his pauldrons, in order to protect his shoulders from harm. And he's also got a couple of hands hanging off of the belt that he has around his waist. Now I wanted to make it look like it was some kind of cartoon looking, kind of Frankenstein looking rotting flesh type of thing. So because I decided to use 2 thin layers of palm leaf by Applebarrel paint, this is exactly the same color we used for the Frankenstein monster Arc Walker that we did earlier. We just applied those on those details and we're ready to move on to our next detail. And that next detail, of course, is on the leather goods that these guys are carrying. We're actually doing a combination of both dry brushing as well as base coating. For the 3 fighters on the left-hand side, we decided to pick out the leather goods, which is basically their belts, in 2 thin layers of territorial beige. At the same time, for the guys whose weapons that we had earlier that we did in burnt umber, we're going to dry brush those with territorial beige as well. You can get this color at your local Walmart, and it costs about 50 cents. It's nice, it's cheap, and it looks amazing when you use it. Now, as for these 3 fighters, they don't really actually have any leather goods on them. What they do have, though, is cording of rope that they have wrapped around their waist. So in order to pick up that cording look, what we decided to do is to use light mocha by Applebarrel paint. I put 2 thin coats on the cording around both Arc Walkers on the left as well as right-hand side. As well as the guy in the middle, I actually used the taupe gray by Anita's acrylic to pick out his leather goods as well. And once we get to do that, we gotta just do some really small finishing touches before we move on to our metallics. So for the Necromancer, I just dry brushed the green hands that he has on his outfit with just some lime sherbet. This is exactly the same color that we used for the giant armed Frankenstein-looking Arc Walker before, which you can kind of see in the back right-hand corner. We just do a quick dry brush of that to bring out those details, and we're ready to move on to our last bit of clothing before we move on to the metallics. And the last color we're going to work on is on the guard-looking Arc Walker. That's the guy's arm with the halberd. We decided to pick out his tunic in 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic True Red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a beautiful, vibrant red color that I use in almost all our miniature painting. Looks absolutely fantastic. And we just put 2 thin layers on that to make him kind of contrast with the rest of the warband. And now that we're done with that red element, the next thing we're going to work on now is on all the metallic elements. So the first detail we're going to work on are all the little electrodes that are actually coming off of the bodies of most of the Arc Walkers as well as the Necromancer's staff. Now for that color, we're going to use 2 thin coats of Folk Arts Anniversary Silver. It's a nice, vibrant, bright silver color that has a bit of a blue tinge to it. So I don't really use Anniversary all that often because of that blue tinge. But the reason why I'm using it for these miniatures is because it kind of looks like that the metallic elements sticking out of their bodies are crackling with electric energy. And that's something that seemed kind of cool to me at that time. So as you can see for the Arc Welders, a little electrode and diodes coming out of their bodies. I picked out 2 thin layers of that color. Same thing with the top of the electrical staff that the Necromancer is also wearing. I also put this on the fish scale armor that the guard is wearing as well to make it look like that electricity is actually keeping this guy alive and it's transferring through his armor. Now, as for the rest of the metallic elements, I pretty much used three different colors in order to do that. For all the dark silver elements, for like blades of weapons and that kind of thing, I put two thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. This costs about 75 cents at your local Walmart. For all the gold elements that also exist on these guys, like for example the staff of the Necromancer, as well the belt buckles, that kind of thing, I put two thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And then for the copper wiring that's between the different electrodes these guys are wearing, I picked out two thin layers of copper by Folk Art as well. Also 75 cents at your local Walmart. And the last bit of detailing I worked on before we move on to the bases are on the eyes of all the characters, as well as the electrodes that they have on their body as well. For the little bulbs on the top of the electrodes, as well as the Necromancer staff, as well as for most of these guys' eyes as well, I picked those details on two thin layers of Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. This is a nice bright blue, almost teal looking color, and I did that to make it look like these guys are kind of glowing, like there's electricity coursing through their bodies, and this was keeping them animated. And it's a nice contrasting color for all the details that we did earlier. And now that we're done with that last detail, the next thing we need to work on are on the bases. So as I mentioned before, there's a beautiful cobblestone alleyway kind of texturing done on the base to make it look like these guys are walking around a city street. So because I decided to use two thin layers of pewter gray by Apple Barrel Paint, I just painted the entirety of the bases as well, so that way we have that nice kind of cobblestone looking coloring done to the bases. And to add a last little bit of detail to this, to these bases, I decided to dry brush these in pale gray by Folk Art. It's a off-white, that's a really light gray that's almost off-white. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. I just do a quick dry brushing on this so that way it catches upon the edges of the cobblestone to add that little bit of highlighting as well as detail for the bases. And once we're done with that, the next stage, of course, is an oil wash. Alright, so because we're doing a quick paint method, we do an oil wash all over the miniatures as well. And for most people, when they do a quick paint method, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a wonderful product. It does exactly what it's advertised. The only problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone is quite expensive at $32 per can. You can, of course, use mid-wax polyshade acrylic and Mission Oak color as a cheaper alternative, which only costs $6.99 at your local Walmart. And that's the color I use for this. And what I do is I apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature, as well as the bases as well. Now the oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures, bringing a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Things like creases of the clothing, as well as the individual muscular fibers of the bodies, the individual pieces of cobblestone and the bases, that kind of thing. The second thing that the oil wash also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing. As you can see, that pastel chalky texture is now gone because the oil wash has done that. And the third thing that it also does as well is it also darkens down the value of the colors that we use. So instead of looking so bright and cartoony like they did earlier, they now look more like a mid-range tone and contrasts very nicely with that darker color. Now you do have to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours, and the reason why is because it does have polyurethane in the stain, just like the Army Painter Strong Tone does. So you do have to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure. In my recommendation, I usually use this as the very last step of whenever I paint, so that way that I can leave it alone. The next day when I come back to it, it'll be dry and ready to go. So next thing we gotta do, of course, is two last things. The first thing we gotta do, of course, is to rim the bases of these miniatures. For this group, because they're undead, I like to make it match up the rest of the undead miniatures I have in my studio's collection. So I use English Ivy Green by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents. It's a beautiful olive drab color that you just put two thin coats along the rim of the bases. And very last step, of course, is to spray matte varnish on these miniatures. And the reason why is because the polyurethane and the mid-wax polyshade does have a kind of like a high gloss finish, and you may or may not like that. So if you do like that, of course, you could skip this next step. However, if you want to have a matte finish on your miniatures, I suggest you take a cheap can of Krylon matte varnish. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about $5.99. Just give them the once over, and it reduces the sheen on that high gloss finish. And as you can see, this is the end result of the warband. We have a beautifully painted warband to a beautiful tabletop standard, and it also didn't cost us very much money at all. In fact, it cost us less than $30 in order to paint up this entire warband. So now that we're done talking about the cheapskate method, let's go and talk about the materials that you need to purchase from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you wanted to achieve the exact same effects that we did, except using those name brand paints. Alright, so these are the materials you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter in order to paint your miniatures the same way we did, except using these name brand paints. You'll need to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, as well as the following colors: Baneblade Brown, Militarm Green, Vulcan Green, Longbeard Gray, Volgrim Pink, Screamer Pink, Cyberite Green, all those colors costing $4.55. You also need to buy a pot of Wildwood, which costs $7.80 for that color, as well as Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylor Brown, Hellion Green, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, and Wells flayed one flesh. Each one of those costs $4.55. You'll need to buy a pot of Talisar Blue, which costs $7.80, as well as Mephiston Red and XV88. Both those colors cost $4.55. For your metallics, you'll need to buy Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Ironbreaker, as well as Retributor Armor, and all four of those cost $7.80 a piece. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which runs $32. And if you want to have a matte finish for these miniatures, you need to buy a can of Mirror Turning Varnish, which costs $19.50. So assuming that you're purchasing all these materials for the very first time in order to paint up this warband, you're talking about a grand total investment of $188.10 that you'll need to spend on both Army Painter and Citadel products in order to achieve the same result. When you compare that with our Cheapskate total of only $29.57, you're talking about a grand total savings of $158.53 by doing the Cheapskate method. So there you guys go. That's how you guys can quickly as well as cheaply paint up the Exiled Dead from your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blog.com. Check out the latest and greatest news about the hobby aspect of this channel. With that being said, you guys, I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.